Okay, so I'm going to be making a sandwich dough, and I'm making a very classic recipe of sandwich dough. And this recipe in French, it's called pain au lait, and it means milk bread. And it is the quintessential white slicing sandwich bread. And it's got a great, very tender crumb from the milk that's in the dough, and also there's a little bit of butter. So I'm gonna show you how to mix this dough using a stand mixer. And so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to scale out my liquid ingredients. I'm gonna scale out my milk. And I need 550 grams of milk. And into that milk, I'm going to measure 20 grams of honey. And then I'm going to scale out 100 grams of butter. This has already been scaled out. So I'm just gonna add it into my liquid. And at this point, I'm gonna pour it right into here. Okay, and now I'm gonna just sort of take my spatula and get the honey out of the bottom. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 18 grams of fresh yeast and 18 grams of salt. If you don't have fresh yeast on hand, I usually use instant yeast, and you can get instant yeast at any grocery store, and it's virtually the same as Active Dry, so if you find Active Dry, you can use Active Dry too. I used 18 grams of fresh yeast. If you want to convert that into instant yeast or into active dry yeast, just divide by 3. So then you'll have 6 grams of instant yeast. And so now I'm going to add in 825 grams of bread flour. And I like to put the liquid ingredients on the bottom of the bowl and then the dry ingredients on the top when I'm using any kind of a mixer. If you try to put the dry ingredients on the bottom first, what happens is that they don't get fully incorporated with the liquid ingredients, and you'll end up with some dry patches in your dough. So now I'm gonna turn the mixer on, and I'm gonna just mix on a very low speed just to incorporate the ingredients. So this is a rather stiff dough, and so I can hear that the mixer is having a hard time incorporating it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the mixer incorporate all of the ingredients, and this is a great little trick. If you don't feel like getting your hands really messy, but you still want to knead your bread by hand, just let the mixer do the work in the beginning by incorporating the ingredients, and then take the dough out and knead it by hand. So that's what we're going to do. We're using a KitchenAid stand mixer, and we're using the dough hook attachment. There's also a paddle attachment for like cookies and cakes. And there's also a whisk attachment or a whip attachment for like beating meringues. So my dough, I'm going to turn the mixer off, and I'm going to lift it up, and I'm going to take this dough out of the mixer. And you can see it's a very soft dough because it's got butter in it. And what's going to happen now is I'm going to finish kneading it by hand. And so I'm just going to dust my hands with the flour, and I'm going to fold over and just sort of knead this dough really quickly. It's going to get a little messy as I'm going because I'm incorporating the butter into the dough. So I'm moving this dough over to the board to finish it by hand, because as I was listening to the dough mix in the stand mixer, I could hear that the motor, it's a very heavy piece of dough, and the motor wasn't going to be able to handle the kneading of this dough. So in this case, it's just better to mix it by hand. I'm going to add a little more flour to my surface so that the dough doesn't stick. And I'm really using the weight of my hands and my body. I'm sort of pushing into the dough when I'm kneading it. And that really helps it come together faster. And I'm using a lot of flour on this dough, on the surface as I'm kneading it, because there is butter in this dough and it is a stickier dough, and a little bit of flour for this recipe isn't going to affect the outcome too much. So I'm going to knead this for about 6 to 7 minutes. Okay, so I've been kneading this dough for about 6 or 7 minutes, and it looks to me like it's nicely developed. I'm going to do a quick window pane test just to sort of check on the gluten development. And I'm looking for sort of like what looks like a window pane. And you can see that it's starting to form. And so I'm very happy with how my dough is developing. And so at this point, I'm going to lightly oil a bowl. And I'm using vegetable oil. And then I'm going to put my dough in this bowl. I'm going to cover this dough with a cloth so that the surface doesn't dry out. And I'm going to ferment the dough for 2 hours, and I'm going to fold the dough halfway in between. And folding means punching down the dough, and it's a very organized technique of redistributing the yeast. Okay, so the sandwich dough has been fermenting for 1 hour, and at this point we're going to punch it down, or we're going to do what bakers call turning. And so that is simply taking the dough, and you can see it's risen quite nicely, and we're going to fold it, and by folding it and deflating it, we're redistributing the yeast, and we're just basically folding it like a letter, and we're rotating it and folding it like a letter one more time, and then we're flipping it over on itself, and then we're going to let it ferment for 1 more hour, and then we'll divide it. And that is how you make a sandwich dough.